Good evening and welcome back to Harvard Hillel and our speaker series. Just in the past week, things have changed once again dramatically in Israel with Iran's attack on Israel on Saturday night into Sunday morning Israel time. And this evening, we are honored and very fortunate to have with us two scholars to help us unpack and understand these events. First, we have Daniel W. Drezner, who's a professor of international politics at Fletcher, the Graduate School of Global Affairs at Tufts University. He's also a non-resident senior fellow at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs and the co-director of Fletcher's Russia and Eurasia program. He previously held positions with the Civic Education Project, the RAND Corporation, and the United States Department of Treasury. He's written 7 books, including All Politics is Global and Theories of International Politics and Zombies. He's also edited 3 others. Daniel has published articles in numerous scholarly journals, as well as in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Politico, and Foreign Affairs, and has been a regular contributor to Foreign Policy and the Washington Post. Daniel, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
We also have with us Avishay Ben Sasson-Gordis, who is a friend and a lecturer in government at the Harvard University Department of Government. He's a Lady Davis postdoctoral fellow at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. His research lies at the intersection of normative political theory and international relations. Avishay was a Stone PhD scholar in inequality and wealth concentration at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government and is currently a research fellow at Molad, the Center for the Renewal of Israeli Democracy. He publishes research and analysis in Hebrew and English on a variety of issues, mostly in the area of civil-military relations, Israeli politics, and national security. Avishay, welcome back. You may all remember Avishay from 3.5 years ago in conversation with Nick Burns just after the Abraham Accords. So welcome. It's good to see you again.
It's great to be back.
So I'll begin with a somewhat broad question for both of you. And Dan, maybe we'll start with you. How significant in your mind were last Saturday night's attacks? And was this just Iran sending a symbolic message or something closer to a serious attack that maybe failed to achieve its aims?
I would put it somewhere in between, I guess, which of course is the safe response. But I mean, I think the best description I've seen of Iran's attack was that it was spectacular but not significant, in the sense that you're talking about launching hundreds of missiles at Israel. And in a lot of ways, this is unprecedented. I mean, it's the first time Israel has attacked Iran directly, despite a long, years, if not decades, of low-level proxy warfare. So in that respect, this is all an order of magnitude in terms of difference in terms of prior attacks. That said, Iran was also very clear to telegraph exactly what it was planning on doing, and was pretty open about it, in terms of communication with the United States in terms of what was intended. And the attack itself was designed not to hit civilian centers. So, and the statements by, I believe it was the Iranian mission to the UN, indicating we now consider the matter closed, suggests that for Iran, the idea was we can do a spectacular attack in response, recall, to an Israeli attack on the Iranian consulate in Damascus, which was also an escalatory step in a lot of ways. The hope being that that would be it. And now whether that's actually it, of course, is up to the Netanyahu government.
So, Daniel, you used the term escalation there. You referenced that. Obviously, I'm curious to hear your general thoughts of how significant this attack was. And also, how do you think of this notion of escalation? Was Israel's attack on the consulate itself an escalation? Is this an escalation? How do you make of all of that rhetoric?
So Dan's response, I think, was on point in describing a lot of the nature of the exchange beginning from April 1st when Israel struck the consul building in Damascus onwards. What I'm somewhat worried about, and this connects to this idea of escalation, is that you'll often hear Israeli leaders and Israeli elites using the term equations in the context of dialogue by fire, another favorite term for Israeli elites. And the idea is that we do this and that's equal that. So if Hezbollah attacks in a certain way, there's a rote response that Israel responds with. And right now, you hear Israeli leaders still using these terms, and you hear Iranians using their conception of what they consider to be the equivalent of one kind of action to another kind of action. What I'm concerned about and how this event is unfolded is that really we're in uncharted waters, and the actors participating in it fail to perceive that that's where we are. They keep thinking that their actions are readable and completely legible to the other side, and that what they consider a certain kind of action is what the other side considers the same kind of action. So if you think about the April 1st attack, Israel considers that an attack on a somewhat legitimate target. Escalatory, yes, because it's a senior figure that Israel doesn't attack on a regular basis, also kind of difficult to catch on a regular basis, which is, it seems to be at least partially why Israel attacked this person. This was somebody who was on the wait list to be for assassination as far as Israeli security apparatus were thinking about it for a long time. And Israeli security apparatus and leadership didn't really consider the site of the attack to be significant. If it had any ambassadorial status as far as Israel was concerned, it might have been voided by the fact that it was being used by the Quds Force for coordination with other kinds of actors in the area. And then on Iran's part, the idea that they would strike from Iranian territory onto Israeli soil and do so, but only focus on military installations, fails to quite understand how Israelis think and process national security. And I'm concerned that that's ongoing, that Israel thinks that it's its turn to respond. Now, international pressure may have moved us further away, but you asked me about escalation. I shifted it to a term like equations. But so long as people keep thinking that they understand how the game is played, but actually a different game is being played right now, or no game at all, we're making up the rules as we're going along, that's a very dangerous place to be in.
I'm curious how you think of, you mentioned sort of the Israeli psyche and what this attack may have meant. But Iran could have chosen maybe to activate Hezbollah more, which may have actually caused more civilian damage on Israeli territory. So what do you make of that choice of Iran sort of attacking? Seems like a game changer maybe from its own territory directly towards Israel, but in terms of impact, that was probably less than a series of hundreds or thousands of rockets from Hezbollah.
Yeah, there are three elements we should keep in mind about the use of Hezbollah in this event. One is we're not entirely sure what the exchange behind the scenes was. I've seen some indications in public media that Iranians were hoping for more involvement from Hezbollah and that Hezbollah turned them away. I don't know that that's true. The relationship between Iran and Hezbollah is very much a proxy and activation one, but still one where Hezbollah has their own interests and their ability to assert some ground. So that's one thing I would say. The two other elements worth keeping in mind here is that while using Hezbollah, was attacking directly from Iranian soil, is breaking new ground, there are certain ways in which the real war between Iran and the real full-scale war between Iran and Israel will be, if ever played, hopefully not, will be played between Hezbollah and Israel. Israel and Iran are so far away that you can only skirmish so far. And so Iran has built Hezbollah's power to function as both a deterrent against nuclear attacks on its nuclear project and just in general attacks on Iranian interests. And to draw Hezbollah into that war right now, when it's already extended, when it's already worn down, there's no element of surprise. Within Lebanon, there's a strong push against getting involved in this. This would actually expand it much further. It's a step up from what we saw last Saturday. It's not a step down from what we saw last Saturday in my analysis, to use Hezbollah to attack Israel.
Daniel, I'm curious to hear your thoughts
And
about.
Donnie, if I
ahead.
may add one more thing, Hezbollah was involved just on a minor scale by shooting from Syria into the Golan, which is one more way of distancing the skirmish from Lebanon proper.
Mm-hmm. Daniel, your thoughts on that and sort of Hezbollah's role here and how Iran's using them?
I mean, I think there's a way in which you can argue that Iran has, in this kind of warfare, and Avishai used the word equation. The word I would use is reciprocity. In other words, it's the question of if Iran, does something, Israel feels like it has to respond. Similarly, if Israel does something, Iran feels like it has to respond. And there's an aspect of this, and I don't mean to be humorous here, I'm sure you've been in an argument with someone else where the other person feels like they absolutely must have the last word on the subject. And, as a result, the argument never ends.
This
And
is
that's
a
kind of
hello.
where
This has
we
never
are.
happened.
No, I was going to say, I mean, I'm sure, obviously, being Israeli, this would never be something that you would have experienced before. But there is an element of this. And part of the problem here, I do think, for Israel is that Iran, by building up its axis of resistance, by building up these proxy forces, it has a longer ladder in terms of its choices, in terms of responding. In other words, what made this unique, what made this the missile attack unusual, was that Iran did it directly from Iranian soil. Most of what Iran has done in terms of trying to target Israel, and that's what they've been trying to do, has not been, it's mostly been indirect. It's been using proxy forces like Hezbollah, like Hamas, like the Houthis, and so on and so forth. The problem that Israel has is that it doesn't really have those proxies. And so anytime there's an attack on it, it feels it has to respond directly, and it's Israel doing the responding. And so that complicates things, I think, a little bit for Israel, and it taxes Israel perhaps a little bit more. I think the other thing I would say, and this is where I also have some concern in terms of how this goes forward, is that you can argue that in terms of time horizons about what the region's going to look like, frankly, Iran has displayed somewhat more strategic patience than Israel has. In that Iran has taken years, if not decades, to build up all of these various proxy forces. Now it's done so at a cost to itself, but it's built them up so that it can engage in this kind of action against Israel. Israel's response almost always is, as Avishay pointed out, is either dialogue by fire or mowing the lawn, or essentially short-term tactical moves that might actually, disrupt some of these proxies, but don't solve the long-term problem. And that's something that fundamentally concerns me going forward.
And so, what would you be your advice for a sound long-term strategy on Israel's part?
Wait, one is to take your time in terms of responding to this attack. In some ways, the recommendation I would offer for Israel is that if Iran's attack was, spectacular but not deadly, if I was Israel, I would aim for deadly but not spectacular, in the sense of you don't want to make this something that is public. Because anytime if it's a public attack and if you're crowing about it, that is just going to force Iran to respond. On the other hand, if it's somehow done in a covert fashion, if it's done in a way that minimizes the press about it, then there's a way in which Iran would pay a price, but also wouldn't necessarily feel obligated to respond. And this requires some strategic patience on Israel's part. It requires, a situation in which they need to pick and choose their spots in order to attack. And, if we look at what Israel's done over the last 6 months, I'm not sure how much strategic patience they've demonstrated. Hopefully they can move down the learning curve on this.
Avishay, what do you think about it?
Possibly, I'd say before Danny, if I may jump in,
Please?
it's not necessarily just move down on this ladder or evolve. It's also move back in time. Israel, throughout the years, according to publications, things we've read in the New York Times and other venues, has been able to do deadly but not spectacular. One story that comes to mind is, according at least to one report, Israel was involved in assassinating the head of the Iranian military nuclear program with a highly sophisticated robot mounted with a machine gun. That is pretty much on point, and it didn't start a war.
Right.
And I think that speaks volumes to Dan's ideas here and thinking on this. And if I may say, well, let's go, Danny. I'll let you keep going.
So, Avishay, I'm curious if that kind of more covert, actions on Israel's part. What do you think is the Israeli public's appetite or need at this moment for something which actually might be more dramatic or more flashy? Right. After all, on Saturday night, 2 a.m. or whatever it was, Israel time, most of the country ended up having to head to shelters. And is there really a tolerance now for something that might be deadly but not spectacular?
I think the Israeli public is surprisingly lucid about this, or not surprisingly, but lucid about this. First of all, by Monday morning, Israelis were mostly angry that schools were not effectively reopened in time. The the rear guard command let out the order that schools could be open too late in the day, and not everybody's schools were able to reopen, and that's what Israelis were busy with, which tells you something about resilience under fire. I'm not sure it speaks to the uniqueness of the situation in which Israel lives, but it also tells you that the public wasn't clamoring for something to happen immediately. You saw the difference compared to October 7th. After October 7th, the Israeli psyche hasn't reverted immediately, arguably hasn't reverted yet to any sort of normalcy. We also have some polling. So a poll conducted at Hebrew and Tel Aviv University this week said the numbers, if I recall correctly, by Molad, were that 52% to 48% when faced with the two options are against an immediate Israeli retaliation. And when asked if retaliation will harm relationships with allies who assisted in foiling the Iranian attack, that number jumps up to 74%. So Israelis are
just to reinforce Avishay's point, I mean, my understanding is that Israel considered, the war cabinet considered a response on Monday and then ruled it out, probably in no small part because they were told by allies, don't do this.
Right, exactly. And I think this connects us back to your point earlier, Dan. Israel is probably not going to be able, given its ethnic, strategic, historical isolation in the region, going to be able to set up a network of proxies that looks anything like that of Iran's. What Israel, in its more strategic moments, has been able to talk about is creating a network of alliances built around, first of all, fear of Iran among the Sunni states, and second of all, during certain periods in time, around an understanding that Israel can change its place in the region. The Abraham Accords were one attempt at this. Post-October 7th, even more than before, it will require some give on the Israeli-Palestinian issue. And this government has been unable to do that. So all of this connects back in a certain way, in many ways, to domestic Israeli politics, which we haven't brought up yet, but those play an important role here as well. So Israel's inability to act strategically, Dan mentioned that he's concerned that over the last 6 months, Israel hasn't demonstrated necessarily always the best strategic sound reasoning. Much of that comes down to pressure points and veto points and the politics of the domestic Israeli audience. Some of it not, but some of it is about that. And so the inability or some of the difficulties in creating this network come down to Israel, to choices Israel has to make about where it positions itself domestically versus the Palestinians and within the region.
So I should just follow up about that. In your mind, how much longer do you think Netanyahu has, and what do you think would change if and when he leaves office?
I can point to things. So 2026 is where the next elections are scheduled by law. Netanyahu hopes to get there and figure out something by then. That's as usual. He's not a strategist. Netanyahu, both in conduct and in character, is a tactician, brilliant one and a lucky one. But he is not a strategist most of the time. And so he's hoping to get to tomorrow. That's the play right now. I can look at several crisis points that are going to make it difficult for him to get there. The biggest one looming right now that I can see easily solved, and to my mind is the biggest hurdle for the survival of this government, is the question of Haredi conscription, which sounds odd. How after October 7th and everything that's happened in Israel over the last year and over the last 6 months, what breaks the government is the fact that you can't fund some yeshivas between now and the beginning of the next budget or something, or until you figure it out. But this is how these things work, because domestic politics make it so. The question is, who out of the 64 members of Netanyahu's coalition will defect first, if anyone? They have good reasons to hang by each other, because otherwise, to hang with each other, otherwise they'll hang next to each other, however the saying goes.
To hang together rather than hang
separately.
Thank
you, Dan.
No problem.
That was painful. So they have strong incentives to remain loyal. But those incentives won't beat everything. And the Haredi parties may come to defect if there's no. I've come to believe the Haredi parties will not stay in, or are incredibly unlikely to stay inside, unless the conscription issue is solved, and it's not clear to me that it is easily solvable. Now, what changes after this government leaves? Israel's next government, if you believe current polling, is most likely to be comprised primarily, if not exclusively, of Jewish parties. The Islamic Party of Ra'am is unlikely to make a return. If you believe how the conversation is going, I will be saddened if that's the case, but that's not unreasonable. It will have a strong center-right, ideological right contingency within it. Again, if you believe current polling, it will be a party that's likely headed by somebody like Naftali Bennett, if not Naftali Bennett himself. And current coalition parties will likely comprise somewhere between 40 and 50 seats. That can change up and out of the Knesset 120. That kind of government is limited in what it can achieve strategically. It can solve certain Israeli problems, but not all of the question Israel has to decide right now. Israel is at a crossroads that will likely determine major facets of what the next few decades of its future look like. And I'm hopeful that it can make certain choices that are likely to lead it in the more prosperous, liberal, democratic angle that we might have been hoping for throughout 2023. I worry that there are real challenges to achieving that.
And in terms of prosecuting this war or the strategy with regard to Iran, how significant would of a pivot would happen if Netanyahu were to be replaced by the government that you described?
Well, I think on both issues, on the war in Gaza, Israelis are not really told this, or they're told this and they keep not hearing it. The war in Gaza is largely over. What remains is not what we saw before. The order of forces currently operating in Gaza is a fraction of what it was before. It's not going to grow again to anything like it was before. And now we're in a different set. We're dealing with a different set of military and political problems there. So I think if a new government steps in and is willing to make decisions about what's come to another one of those terms that may have had any meaning in the past but has lost it since, the day after. So we might have a government that's more willing to make some sort of decision about the day after. As for Iran, that's a broader problem that's not going to be resolved right now. Hopefully it doesn't escalate into full-on war this week. But if it doesn't, then I don't think we're going to see a basic shift. If there's a basic shift or a fundamental shift, it's going to come out of those regional alliances that we talked about earlier.
Yeah, I want to give you a chance to respond, Abishai, and maybe specifically on this point that the war in Gaza is mostly over. Do you view it that way?
I'm going to defer to Abishai on when it comes to the matters of Israeli domestic politics, because that does require its own PhD. But in terms of Gaza, I hopefully agree with him. There is this question of the final assault on Rabat and what that'll look like. I think one of the issues is that, and one of the ways in which weirdly the Iranian attack was a life raft for Netanyahu was that you have to remember that prior to this attack, you were finally seeing. The fact is that the Biden administration for months had been sort of doing this dual track strategy of simultaneously backing the Netanyahu government to the hilt in terms of materiel, in terms of aid, and then also leaking to the press multiple sources of frustration with the Netanyahu government in terms of what their strategy was. It seemed last month that had finally come to a head, that essentially Biden was for the first time, willing to say, look, we're going to condition aid on a couple of things. There was this sort of very come to Jesus moment between Biden and Netanyahu. There is increased frustration, I think, on the U.S. side about the fact that Israel doesn't really have a day after plan for Gaza. And what's noteworthy is that, to back up Avishai's point, to the extent that Israel and the United States do have a longer term strategy in the Middle East, it is in fact to create a counter coalition to Iran, building on the Abraham Accords, trying to get Saudi Arabia into the fold. And it's simultaneously remarkable that Saudi Arabia hasn't rejected this since the October attacks. That's kind of interesting. I mean, obviously they've put demands in terms of what would have to happen in Palestine. The fact they haven't said no categorically, does indicate a potential opportunity. The problem is that I'm not sure it's an opportunity that Israel can take, because for that to happen, you would actually have to see the creation of something of an independent Palestinian state, and that is not something that this government is it all prepared to do? And that's the real problem here, is that there's domestic constraints. Now, the question that I have, and I'm not sure, I don't know this, and I'm curious what Avishai's thought about this, is whether there is any Israeli government, assuming that Netanyahu falls, that would actually be posed to take that, potential offer.
That's a great question. I don't think that there's a government that is willing to grant it right now. I think there are governments that are willing to rhetorically concede the point. And then the question is what happens next? People in the world tend to focus on the term that usually comes up as the occupation, but really the challenge, both politically and for Palestinian political viability, is not so much military occupation as it is civilian settlement. And that's where most of the difficulty in terms of political capital comes through. This is where I think one thing that the Biden administration has done and hasn't necessarily gained as much attention and has changed significantly previous policies is the beginning of sanction of efforts on settlers. And that's something that I think can shift both Israeli governments and the Israeli public. And here I'm curious, you're the expert on that one, that's several PhDs of its own. But my read of how that can play out in Israel is that it can play out very, very differently to how it played out in other arenas, given Israel's integration into global financial markets, given how separate the targeted sector is, and what the contours of what the Biden administration is trying to achieve with its use, or one interpretation of what the Biden administration is trying to achieve with its use of financial executive powers. And I think as that pressure grows, if that pressure grows, and as that pressure grows, then it becomes more likely that Israeli governments will budge on that issue, on the issue of outlining not just a path towards two states, but actually taking steps to curtail civilian hold on the West Bank.
Thank you for asking a sanctions question, because this is where I finally feel comfortable after the first, 27 minutes of this conversation. What I would say is that if the U.S., because of what it's done already, and if the signal the U.S. is sending is we are going to sanction actors if you engage in further, settlements in the West Bank, would that be effective? There's some good news and there's some bad news here. The good news is that in all likelihood, these sanctions would in fact be extremely effective. In no small part because the U.S. is Israel's most important, most strategic ally. So if the U.S. actually is willing to threaten these kinds of sanctions or impose these kinds of sanctions, Israel has to realize that it's got to be able to make those concessions, because there's much greater flows and much greater benefits it gets from the overall strategic relationship, and therefore would probably want to acquiesce. There's also precedent for this. I mean, in the sense of the most obvious example of this would be back in 1991 when the U.S. threatened loan guarantee suspensions unless the Shamir government, froze settlements and attended the Madrid peace conference. So the demand that you would place with these sanctions is sufficiently targeted and achievable such that I actually think the sanctions would work. That's the good news. The bad news is the domestic politics of the United States come into play here now, because while it is true that the sanctions in 1991 worked, it's also true that George H.W. Bush did not get reelected in 1992. And I don't want to say those two things are completely tied together. They're not. But there is a concern as the Biden administration is trying to run for reelection of, which constituencies can they afford to alienate and which constituencies can they not. Now, we're in 2024 and it's not 1991. And you can argue that from a political perspective, it is possible the Biden administration would actually benefit from applying some coercion, because there are certain constituencies, whether we're talking about, younger Americans or Arab Americans, that would then see that potentially as, changing their mind on Biden. On the other hand, there are plenty of other constituencies in the middle that might be alienated from Biden taking this action. So it's a tough diplomatic. I think it can be done, just to be clear, but it would require, and by the way, I also think, and this is just a hunch, this isn't based on any inside knowledge, well, it's based on a little inside knowledge. I think there are aspects of the Biden foreign policy team that are itching to do this. That, it's worth remembering that for all the claims about, Joe Biden being enfeebled or not, the Republican criticism of he's not really in charge of his foreign policy. He is in charge of the Israel policy. This is entirely him. And I think if there were other, if his cabinet, his national security cabinet actually had, more authority on this, you would be seeing a somewhat different policy towards Israel.
Dan, I've got another sanctions question for you.
Okay.
And that has to do with the sanctions that America is slapping on Iran today. How effective do you think those will be? How effective have past sanctions been? And overall, as a general approach, is this something that can actually shift Iran's course?
All right, let's see. So in order, will the sanctions today be effective? No. I mean, they'll hurt Iran's economy a little more, but I'm honestly not sure at this point what else can be sanctioned by the United States on Iran. Have the sanctions up to date worked? It depends on what you mean by worked. I would argue that they have the part of the problem with sanctions very often, and particularly part of the problem with the last decade of sanctions. And interestingly enough, this goes back to the JCPOA deal that the Obama administration negotiated with Iran, because you could argue that deal doesn't happen without the sanctions that were in place prior to that. They really did pressure Iran to come to the bargaining table and actually hammer out an agreement. But one of the dangers of that was that it caused a lot of policymakers in Washington who previously had been skeptical of sanctions as a foreign policy tool to suddenly see it as the policy option of first resort. This is due to the fact that increasingly the U.S. imposes economic sanctions not through the trade channel, but through the financial channel, because essentially the dollar is so important, and because U.S. capital markets are so important, they can often impose sanctions, basically cutting entire countries, in the case of Iran, off from global capital markets because they can't get access to the dollar and they can't get access to corresponding banking accounts. When the Trump administration withdrew from the JCPOA in 2018 and reimposed all of these, it did so unilaterally. The European governments actually fought this. They tried to create an alternative payment mechanism for Iran, something called Instex, which did not work at all. It's telling that Iran, that even when the U.S. acted unilaterally in 2018, they were actually more potent sanctions than what happened before the JCPOA. And if you look at Iran's economy, there are ways in which these sanctions have really devastated the economy. The problem is they haven't done anything in terms of altering Iran's foreign policy behavior, except, if anything, making it worse, in the sense that Iran has accelerated its nuclear program. It's accelerated its funding of proxies and other sort of forces of chaos in the Middle East. So the sanctions have weakened Iran's economy, but it's stiffened the Iranian regime's resolve to continue to implement their foreign policy. So I don't expect any additional sanctions to have any effect on Iran's behavior.
So I'm curious, what do you think is a long-term strategy with regard to Iran, both for Israel and for the United States? Especially, I think today, Iran's threatening to change its nuclear doctrine, which who knows how significant that threat particularly is. But sort of long-term, Iran's been moving towards a nuclear weapon becoming a greater threat. What do you think America's strategy should be? And then, Avishay, for you, what do you think Israel's strategy should be?
I'm not sure the U.S. I mean, actually, Nahal Tusi had a great piece in Politico earlier this week, questioning, frankly, whether the Biden administration had a long-term strategy about Iran. I think to the extent that there is a strategy towards Iran, it is trying to expand the Abraham Accords, trying to essentially create a counter coalition so that Iran's ability to make mischief across the region is limited. And this is where Iran's own behavior, by the way, facilitates this, because it's not like Saudi Arabia is thrilled about the Houthis in Yemen, or Jordan is thrilled about what's going on in Syria and so forth. The problem is on that front that it's limited to some extent by the extent to which Israel can change its behavior and potentially become part of that coalition. The other issue to realize is that this is where what's happening in the Middle East gets tied into a much larger geopolitical chessboard, because one of the other things that's really happened over the last couple of years is the degree to which Iran and Russia in particular have really, cemented their strategic partnership in a way that before was sort of tactically convenient, but now is much more, in earnest. And, in some ways, the way I like to refer to this is that you're seeing a coalition of the sanctioned, in the form of Iran, North Korea, Russia, you name it, where Iran and North Korea are perfectly happy to bust the sanctions against Russia, and in doing so, gain an ally in the UN Security Council that will potentially weaken their own sanctions, which is what you saw, by the way, with respect to North Korea earlier this week, where Russia vetoed, one of the measures with respect to them. And so that's where I think this administration and potentially future administrations need to think a little more creatively about where Iran fits, not just in the region, but globally.
Now, Avishay, before you answer your question, I'll just let our audience know towards the end of our program, we'll have a few minutes for your questions. If you want to ask a question, click the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen, type that in by name, and then if we select your question, we'll promote you to become a panelist, turn on your audio and video, and ask your questions directly. In order to do so, we need to know who you are, so make sure you don't ask your question anonymously, and also please only ask the question if you're willing to come on screen. Avishay, what do you think Israel's long-term strategy with regard to Iran is, and what should it be?
Well, again, unlike the U.S., Israel or Netanyahu, who's governed Israel most of the time since 2009, has had a long-term strategy for Iran, and it failed spectacularly. It was try to avoid, first of all, it was try to create as much international pressure as possible while setting the Iranian nuclear program back with various active measures. And then once the JCPOA was signed in 2015, try to get it rescinded and get the U.S. on board with solving Israel's problems for it. It seemed like for a time Israel appeared to be prepared to deal with the nuclear program itself with military means. I'm not entirely convinced. I don't know, which is why I feel somewhat comfortable talking about it. If I knew, I wouldn't be saying anything, but I don't get the sense that Israel is quite as capable as it may have been in the past to set the program back. The program is also better protected. So even military measures would probably require, to be fully effective, support that Israel cannot create by itself. And it's not clear for how long it would set the Iranians back, given they've learned the lessons of the Israeli attacks against the Syrian and Iraqi nuclear programs in the past, and other nuclear programs that have been set back by international forces. So you can think of the Libyan program, the South African programs that have a single fail point are easier to set back. And the Iranians have built their program much more robustly. So that's a big challenge. The other issue is there's somewhat of a trade-off between dealing with Iran's regional shenanigans and dealing with its nuclear program. There's a complementarity and a trade-off. The complementarity is Iran uses the proxies as a shield, and you have to deal with that layer before you choose to deal with whatever it's doing on the ground. On the other hand, there's a trade-off because time spent dealing with those issues is time not spent dealing with Iran. During the JCPOA, one of the bargaining chips that it used in order to sign the deal was that the ally, the P5+1, the other side to the agreement, was required to take out some of the sanctions on regional actors, or the U.S. was hoping for a grand bargain. The grand bargain didn't happen because the Iranians wanted to keep these issues separate. So it's not entirely clear how you place those elements against each other. Yes, it's terribly important for Israel. And the other thing I would say, the strategy you would use to counter the regional influence of Iran is also one that is likely to make it feel that it is in further need of a nuclear program. So if you increase the pressure on Iran in the region by effectively creating this coalition and defanging its proxies one by one, Iran is more likely, in certain ways, not less likely, to feel like the nuclear program is an insurance policy that it needs in order to guarantee the regime's survival. And so I'm not entirely, I don't envy anyone who has to solve these issues, which is how it's our get out of jail free card as academics. But I do think anything that Israel wants to achieve in regards to Iran is more likely to happen when Israel is better integrated into diplomatic Western and regional circles, despite what I just said about the sense of pressure. And so Israel's strategy, both in terms of dealing directly with Iran and dealing within the region, requires it to figure out ways to reduce the efforts it spends in other areas and be able to focus on this issue if it truly thinks that this is the main issue on its plate. And not by ignoring those issues, which was the way in which governments up until now did it. Netanyahu's main strategy was, I did, I don't think it really was a strategy, but the knee-jerk approach that he had to this was, you don't deal with the Palestinians, it's not a real problem. People will figure it out once they see what Iran is actually doing. I think now, especially post October 7th, the sense is, if you want to be able to clear up the time to deal with either Hezbollah or with Iran, whichever one you think is the bigger actual threat, then you need to do it from a position where you've closed as many of the other open issues. And to do so requires a commitment to setting those to solving those issues, not just by military means, but dealing with them diplomatically and as part of an alliance instead of alliances.
Dan, do you have anything you want to respond to Avishay on that?
I would just add, in some ways, what Israel is learning and what the U.S. is learning is that you can argue that the Abraham Accords, in some ways, the premise of the Abraham Accords and the premise for some U.S. foreign policy for some time had been that maybe the Israel-Palestinian problem wasn't the central fissure in the Middle East, that you could actually sort of bypass that, keep that, frozen, and then negotiate these separate deals. And then once you negotiated these bilateral deals, then you could deal with the Palestinians from a position of strength. I think this was the position of the Trump administration. This wasn't exactly the position of the Biden administration, but in some ways there was some continuation of it. And what the October attacks, demonstrate is that that's not actually true. Because in order to bring Saudi Arabia in, which is the only strategically significant thing that you were talking about here, Saudi Arabia is going to have two demands, and they are not minor demands. The first is the creation of a Palestinian state, of a somewhat independent Palestinian state, and the second is security guarantees from the United States, which, just to talk, to follow up on Avishai's point, is going to be a pretty serious commitment if Iran does decide that it needs to develop its nuclear deterrent even further. So you're talking about potentially extended nuclear deterrence in the Middle East, in addition to, other steps. And this is after, for lack of putting it, in the United States, I think it would be safe to say that public sentiment is to, retrench further from the Middle East rather than potentially get involved after, a decades-long war in Iraq and even longer war, in terms of the greater Middle East and Afghanistan. And so this is going to require, if that step is taken, it's going to require actual leadership and an attempt to persuade Americans why these kinds of commitments are worth it. And that's not going to be an easy sell. It's not going to be an easy lift. That doesn't mean it's impossible to be absolutely clear. And there are ways in which maybe you can get domestic support for it, but it is a very tricky thread to needle.
I want to return a bit back to the war in Gaza. Now, Avishai, you suggested that it's close to over. But for the last, really now, roughly 2 months or so, there's been an ongoing debate about Israel going into Rafah and strong pressure from the U.S. not to do so. There's been reports today that are saying that in exchange for Israel not directly attacking Iran in retaliation for their attacks last week, that the United States will, I don't know, some level of support not stand in the way of Israel going into Rafah. So I'm curious what you think of this. I'm curious also, from Dan, how much do you think the Biden administration, its political posturing, their vocal opposition to Rafah, in which case they'd be more likely to actually allow this now? And Avishai, do you see that as being an integral or kind of a crucial moment within the current situation, Israel going into Rafah? Will that radically or in any way dramatically shape the course of this war?
Let me start by clarifying what I meant by saying that the war is over. I don't want it to be misunderstood. Israel still there are 130 Israelis and people who were in Israel at the time of the Hamas attack who are alive or dead in the hands of Palestinian organizations in Gaza. Even if every Israeli soldier currently in Gaza left Gaza, there are senses in which this war is not over. There are hundreds of thousands of Israelis who are not able to return to their homes. So, and millions of Palestinians in Gaza who are not able to return to their homes. The effects of what has transpired since October 7th are far from being done to affect people's lives. When I say the war is over, what I mean by that is, at the height of the war, you had dozens of brigades in Gaza acting in concert. Right now, that number is reduced to a low single-digit number. So when I say the war is over, and other Israeli military and security figures have said similar things, what I mean is the phase of the war in which a major military campaign that sinks large amounts of military force being actively used in concert with significant amounts of fire, that stage is generally over. Even the Rafah operation is going to be large if it happens, but it's going to be nothing like what happened between November and January. Okay. In terms of whether this is a turning point, I don't think it is. It's a further erosion. What Israel's been doing with these operations is it's been entering a specific area, disrupting Hamas's ability to operate its forces in a very concentrated and concerted and coordinated manner. Those people don't vanish, even if Israel kills. So there were about 40,000 Hamas operatives in the beginning of the war. We're talking about, let's say, a third of all those killed in Gaza were truly operatives. So that places the number at something like 12,000 right now. Not all of them are Hamas. Some of them are Islamic Jihad. So Israel is tried at about 25% of Hamas's force in fighters. And then let's say so it's done significant damage to its underground infrastructure. That's probably a more persistent achievement. In terms of military achievements, it's highly unusual and successful in what Israel has been able to do operationally. And doing so in Rafah is a continuation of that and a necessary step because Rafah is also the connection point between Egypt and the Gaza Strip. So any attempt to prevent a flow of arms and personnel and knowledge in the future requires some severance to sever that connection somehow. But in terms of the grand picture, it doesn't change our understanding of what's going on. Israel has mostly conquered Gaza, has heavily disrupted civilian life there, has caused, in response to Hamas's attacks and in pursuing its goals, many of them legitimate in terms of international war, has caused immense human suffering in the process of doing so. And that's going to remain the situation if Israel goes into Rafah. What Rafah can turn into a turning point is in 2.5 ways, I'd say. One is that Israel public opinion, which has been tilting very, very negatively against Israel, will fully tilt against Israel, moving the remaining governments against Israel if Israel doesn't do what it needs to do. That's the 1.5 governments and publics. And then the other one is if Israel does choose to do what's required to do in terms of giving some answer to humanitarian concerns, at least the plans that are being drawn up are some of the plans that people have talked about earlier in the war as what Israel could have done to avert much of the negative consequences of what it's done in Gaza to itself, by finding more stable humanitarian solutions for people's lives and bringing in other forces to start administering daily life in a way that replaces Hamas and doesn't just bring back power to it. If Israel is able to do that, which is going to be an even bigger lift strategically than the ones Dan wasn't sure Israel was capable of before. But it is a necessary one. And if Israel is able to pull that off, that can set a course that is not a full correction of some of the impasses that Israel has entered into, but can end up positive in other ways.
Dan, if you to respond, and also the sense of, what do you think the Biden administration is really hoping for in terms of the next stages of Israel's war in Gaza? The seeming now willingness to allow, so to speak, or not stand in the way of Israel's operation in Rafah.
I mean, the Biden administration is in a tough position because they absolutely do not want to see any further escalation. I mean, their primary goal since, the October 7th attacks has been to prevent this, what is going on between Israel in Gaza from metastasizing to the entire Middle East. And you could argue that the missile attacks are just the latest example of that. So on the one hand, they obviously don't want to see Israel escalate anymore. Now, they're in a stronger bargaining position to do that because, again, it's always worth remembering that part of the reason that Israel, the attack wasn't all that serious, it wasn't just what Iran did, it was also what U.S. forces, allied forces, Jordanian forces did, in addition to Israel, to help stop the missile attack. So it's always worth, it's worth reminding the current Israeli government that they actually had allied support, which is not something that Israel has always had in terms of dealing with Iran, and that's important. The weird thing, though, is that for the Biden administration, the attention caused by Iran's missile attack actually does engender sympathy for Israel, which again, much as what happened initially following October 7th. I guarantee you, no matter how Israel actually goes into Rafah, that sympathy will dissipate. I am skeptical of Israel's ability to go into Rafah the way they want to, in such a way that it doesn't wind up causing, that sort of sympathy to dissolve. On the other hand, I think the Biden administration, if they have to choose between Israel going into Rafah versus going into Iran, they'll take Rafah every day of the week and twice on Sundays. Again, because first of all, as Avishai mentioned, it might actually achieve at least some gains in terms of disrupting Hamas's underground tunnel system, which would be significant. And also, again, to Avishai's point, if this would be the last operation, in other words, part of the issue here for U.S. foreign policy and for U.S. public opinion has been the sense that this conflict does not have an end. If you can actually say by Israel going into Rafah, that's it, now we're actually going to have to confront the day after, that allows a shift in the narrative and a shift in terms of constructing the foreign policy narrative that would say, okay, now we rebuild, for lack of a better way of putting it.
I've got a question about sort of internal politics within Iran. So, we've seen some reports of since October 7th, some of the civilian population there supporting Israel. I think there's some graffiti today also since the Iranian attack. From your own context or what you're hearing, how much do you think this is representative of a larger movement within Iran, or is this just isolated stories that some of us who want to, have a certain kind of hope are just latching on to?
I don't, just to be very clear, I have no direct contacts with Iran. I don't want to, overclaim here, but I will say, ironically, this is something that the Netanyahu government and the Islamic Republic have in common, which is they're both pretty unpopular domestically. It's worth remembering that, even though the sanctions haven't worked in terms of changing Iran's foreign policy, they have triggered a fair amount of popular protests, waves of popular protests in multiple years, and it's been one of the triggers for domestic unrest within Iran. Now, the extent to which that is just urban elites, I think, is unclear. And also, unfortunately, this is where the asymmetry, another asymmetry kicks in. The Islamic Republic is very, very good, if they want to, of repressing that kind of protest. So I don't think, while they're aware of it and they don't like it and they will obviously want to suppress it, the regime is in no danger necessarily of being overthrown.
Avishai, what do you think?
I'm happy to say that while there are things we talked about that I feel that I'm relatively capable of speaking about, this is not my area of expertise. So I'm happy to. I have nothing to add to what Dan said.
Okay, and then maybe just another question for you, Dan, and Avishai, if you want to add on, to this at all. What do you think are the prospects of an eventual regime change within Iran, and what would that take?
I'm just profoundly pessimistic about this. I'm not saying it can't happen. I mean, one of the things about authoritarian regimes is that they look like they are solidly in power right up until the moment that they're not. But in the sense of, very often they can collapse, an edifice can collapse that looks imposing, but it turns out there's not much there. I'm not sure that's the case with Iran. And so even if the economy is struggling, even if inflation is over 40%, even if there's domestic unrest because of high consumer prices, the regime has a reasonably impressive coercive apparatus that it can gets access to scarce goods, and as a result also has a domestic political economy that favors those very coercive elements. The IRGC is this in a weird way the backbone of the sort of resistance economy of Iran. So they're not going to want to see anything changed anytime soon. So I don't see the kind of social revolution that you saw happen in 1979, I guess would be the way to put it. Yeah. And I could be wrong, and I will be happy to be wrong, but it's hard to envision at this point.
Same. I would add on kind of as a note to this is if the regime changes, we're not guaranteed that the regime changes for what we would consider the better. Like a
Yeah.
stronger IRGC hold on government instead of their very pivotal point in role in decision making right now, um, can turn into a much more prominent role as and it would be a different regime in many respects. We wouldn't consider that the kind of regime change that people on the West are hoping to see. So that's one thing I'd add. And the other is some of those authoritarian regimes that Dan was we're talking about were embedded either in tenuous empires or countries that were post-colonial or other in weak in other kinds of measures of state integrity. And one thing you can say of Iran is it doesn't suffer from that issue. It's a fairly integral state, um, which is helpful for whoever is in power.
I just want to say I'm sorry we're having some technical difficulties, so we won't be able to take questions from the audience. But in lieu of that, Avishai or Dan, in the last 5 minutes, either one of you have a question you want to ask the other.
I, I've gotten a lot of the answers I was hoping to hear from Dan on sanctions, so I'm glad we got some weigh in on that. Um,
I mean, I'm trying to think. I get so. I do have a question for Avishai, which is you said that the way you would picture the next leader of Israel is not, if Netanyahu falls, will be Naftali Bennett. So there's no scenario where Benny Gantz would wind up being the leader, is what you're saying?
no, not at all. What I said was it would be a coalition that would have a strong component of that kind of party. That kind of party is unlikely to be the majority party. It would hold. Polling is notoriously difficult, and we all know the problems. Still, there's a consistent. We've been looking at polls now for a year since the judicial overhaul began, a little over a year, and then 6 months since October 7th. And we've been seeing regular polls, and the numbers are fairly consistent, somewhere between 15 and 20 seats. It could be a little lower, it could be a little higher. Gantz is likely to have a little more. He's currently holding onto he's the parking spot for who knows how many center right voters who would likely move to that party. Um, and then what is the sort of negotiation power that kind of party has? And the day after is going to depend a lot on whether Likud is a viable partner. Bennett became the prime minister when he became the prime minister was because he actually was able to play for either camp. Just like the incentives are relatively straightforward. He was the pivotal voter, um, or the pivotal party. I'm not sure that he's going to be necessarily pivotal in the same way, which will reduce his bargaining power. If his bargaining power is reduced and he's not willing to see not either a Netanyahu or some other Likud leader form a government after the election, then he can't actually play for both teams. In which case, it's more likely that the standard pattern in which the biggest party, and that's still likely to be Gantz, that as we move forward, that gets worn down. But that's still likely to be Gantz. There's a good chance that Gantz is actually likely to end up. You kind of see what the considerations are, though, in thinking through this problem, right?
Yeah. Actually, one last question for you I have, which is, and I think this might be because Americans would tend to assume that after an attack like October 7th, there would be a rally around the flag effect. And I don't think this is true, but I know a lot of people who think Netanyahu's been a survivor for so long, he's just going to play this out until he can finally, recover his political support. Whereas, from what I have read, and this is not an area of expertise, that this was in some ways Netanyahu's Golda Meir moment, and that he's never going to be able to recover from this. And that's the impression I have. But I'm wondering if, as someone who understands, Israeli national security politics a little better than I do, is that the case, or could Netanyahu somehow manage to, resurrect his political fortunes once again?
I am highly doubtful. I will say, Golda Meir won the '74 elections. Um, I just don't think that that's the case here. I think this is beyond redemption, and the way that he's handled responsibility and the war itself and the politics of it, you see a stable base of support, and the settler coalition and the ultra orthodox are unlikely to find a more convenient political partner, but it's really difficult to see him recuperate from this. If anything, my hunch, it's not based on anything, but my very pessimistic hunch is that those people who would like to see right-wing powerful leaders are going to peel off to Ben Gvir. And more than anyone else in Likud right now, Ben Gvir is going to be the beneficiary of the collapse or the end of the Netanyahu era. And it's difficult. Israelis are not very open to the idea of returning to him. So even as you see support eroding for other political actors, he's not gaining any of it back. And even as his lines are, he's succeeding in feeding policy lines into the discourse. He's not the electoral beneficiary of those lines. It's just too difficult for me to see that happen right now.
Avishai and Daniel, I want to thank you so much for your time and your insights. This has been a very insightful conversation, and I am deeply grateful to both of you for your work, for your knowledge and wisdom, and for taking the time to share that with us.
Thank you very much for having us.
I do want to apologize to our audience again for our technical difficulties in taking your questions. I want to wish everyone a happy Passover, and let's hope that things, at least for the moment, can remain a bit peaceful. I think Israelis, for sure, need to have a respite over the upcoming holiday.
Good night, everybody.
Thanks, Matt. Have a good night.
Thanks, Matt.